The system with e5 is a rare guest in tournaments, but you will eventually meet it. It was recommended by Filippenko. After knight c3, knight c6, bishop c4, I like what white did. Solid and positional. Queen c7 is necessary to have the d8 square available to defend the f7 point. After castles, knight f6, knight g5, knight d8, we see black take advantage of that opportunity. However, white should now energetically play f4, open the f-file before black gets fully developed. After e takes f4, e5, d5 is a very sharp counterattack by black. In this game, white played bishop to b5 check. After d5, I totally recommend e takes f6, and on dc4, simply d3, continuing to increase our lead in development. I believe this offers white a very clear, no-risk, logical advantage. After bishop to b5, white was later able to get counterattack with queen to b6. In the game, white imaginatively sacrificed material with e6, and after fe6, bishop e5, and this is where black made the decisive mistake. Capturing the bishop on g5 subjected his king after queen h5 to a horrific attack. After knight f7, queen f7, king d8, and queen g7, white was crawling all over the black king side. Bishop e3 check, king h1, and rook e8 didn't help because after bishop f6 check, king c7, queen g3 check, once he collected this bishop, it was open season on the white king. After king b6, queen takes e3, queen a1, and queen b3 check, the black king was just under horrific attack, and black was going to lose serious amounts of material. Our next game features the maestro himself, Evgeny Sveshnikov against Marko Tratar. This was played in Slovenia in 1997. After e4, c5, c3, 2, d6. d6 is interesting because basically they let you go ahead and set up your structure with d4, and then with knight f6, they start to look to attack your two pawns in the center. One idea Sveshnikov has played is f3. He said this was originally suggested by the King's Indian specialist F.M. Geller, and basically here white just looks to maintain the center and build a very small positional advantage. Sveshnikov mentions that after cd, cd, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and bishop e3, he scored many wins from this position. He says, however, though, that instead of knight c6 as played in the game, that what black should do is black should play d5. After e5, knight at f to d7, f4, you have a bit of a French defense. Here, he had one game with Weingold from Moscow, 1983, went knight c6, knight f3, e6, bishop e2, queen b6, a3, a5, and then b3. Point now is that on a4 you can play b4 and bypass and gain a little space on the queen side. After bishop e7, castles, castles, king h1, f6, rook a2, white had a slight edge, according to Sveshnikov. However, according to Fritz, after cd, cd, and f takes e5, and f takes e5, black is doing okay. But going back to our game at hand, after f3, black in this game played knight to c6, and allowed Sveshnikov to build up and maintain the center with bishop e3. After cd4, cd4, black stuck to his fianchetto ways and played g6. Now, after cd4, d5 is a bit late because white can play more aggressively with knight c3. After d takes e4, you play d5 and try to build some initiative in the center. In our game with Sveshnikov against Tratar from Slovenia in 1997, after g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and queen d2, Sveshnikov was able to get his kind of set formation. His view is that what he has here is kind of the white side of a samish King's Indian, as in this game, or depending on how black plays, might be kind of like the white side of a dragon Sicilian formation. After castles, knight g2, black now plays e5. The correct plan, in my view here, would have been bishop d7, followed by queen a5 and rook at f to c8. This would have been more flexible. After knight at gd2, e5, white plays d5, and after knight e7, basically has, after castles, the white side of a samish King's Indian, except the c-pawns have been exchanged. Well, who does that favor? In a samish King's Indian, white's next pawn break is to play c5 to open up on the c-file in the queen side. And after he reaches c5, he either pushes c6, or more times than not, he exchanges cd-cd. So in this case, it's like white is already 2 or 3 tempi ahead of a normal King's Indian samish variation, which is, even then, probably a little better for white. After knight e8, Sveshnikov now plays a very interesting strategical idea. Normally you would expect king over, and then knight over, maybe rook over, and just let black advance. He does a preemptive strike here on the king side, very instructive. He plays h4. After f5, he now plays h5, threatening to break up the black kingside pawns. After f4, puts the bishop all the way back to g1, and after knight f6, he does not open the h-file. Why? Because the king side is not where white has a space advantage. White has a space advantage in the center, and he's got more pieces pointing to the queen side. Therefore, white wants to attack on the queen side. So why is he advancing the h-pawn? Very simple. With his next move, he shows us. He plays h6. What this does is it boxes in the bishop, and it slows black down on the king side. Note that had he exchanged on g6 after hg, black follows with moves like king f7, rook h8, and very quickly g5, g4, and assumes the initiative on the king side. So Sveshnikov plays very nicely here. He plays h6. So ironically enough, the advance of the h-pawn was actually designed not to open the h-file, but to keep the h-file closed. After bishop h8, though, he does now play g3. What this does is it gives his bishop access, his light-squared bishop, to exchange off the very valuable light-squared bishop that black has. After g5, he exchanges, takes, and he has opened the g-file against the black king. After king b1, knight g6, now he starts bringing his knight over to the queen side, and we can see all of the white pieces, minors, are aimed at the queen side. After knight e8, knight to b3, bishop d7, knight to b5, the first threat appears to capture on a7. After b6, rook c1, he has the c-file, bishop to f6, and we can see black doesn't really seem to be attacking too much over here on the king side. Queen to d3, securing more light squares, protecting the knight, preparing bishop h3, which strategically is highly desirable. Once he exchanges this bishop for this bishop, white will then be left with a beautiful bishop against this one boxed in. Queen b8, and there we are, bishop h3. After bishop takes and rook takes, we can now compare this bishop to this one. And it's hardly a fair comparison. Bishop back to d8, a4. Again, notice how white increases his grip on the light squares. After queen b7, he now drops the rook back, queen d7, and now queen c4. This threatens to simply penetrate with queen to c6. If captures, would give white a powerful passed pawn. After knight e7 to cover, he now drops back and retreats the knight. This threatens further penetration with queen a6. After a6 to keep the queen off of b5 or a6, queen b4, and the b6 pawn comes under pressure. Here, black gets a little bit desperate and decides to sacrifice a pawn. And I thought the play here was quite interesting. White actually does not take the pawn, although there's no reason, I think, that he couldn't. Instead, he plays knight to d2. even Sveshnikov comments that A takes, and then knight d2 is quite strong. In the game, he played knight d2 immediately. Black grabbed the pawn on a4, and now he relocated his knight. After king h8, bishop f2, it appears he contemplates bishop h4, but after knight g6, he now plays bishop to b6, looking to exchange the dark-squared bishops. This is rather surprising, except that it gives him entree into the queenside. After queen b7, queen a5, this forces the exchange. He now captures, and after rook takes, the black pawn on d6 is now defended. White simply recoups his pawn, but vacates the a5 square so his knight can go to a5 and on in to c6 with tempo. After rook at a to c8, white doubles on the file and creates the deadly threat of knight takes on e6 with a double attack on c8. Knight takes, and rook c8 check. That's the threat. So after rook at h to c2, black drops back a knight to defend. But white now powers into c6. And after knight a5, queen a8, knight at 3 to c4, black mercifully resigned and put an end to this nightmare. The threat is simply knight to b6, forking the queen on a8, the rook on c8, and if the queen moves to either b8 or a7, the other knight goes to c6, forking him. If the rook tries to move, say to b8, knight to c6 again forks the two rooks. This was absolutely a classic example of a queenside space advantage. The f3 employed is an interesting system when black plays knight to f6 and d6, as in this game. Very interesting from a strategical point of view was white's advance of the h-pawn. Normally you associate advancing the h-pawn with trying to open the file. In this case he did it to kind of restrain or reduce black's activity on the king side. Very interesting concept. After f5, h5, f4, he dropped back, and then the move h6, keeping things closed for a while until he got his operations on the queen side underway. His later g3, gf, and then the idea was that he ultimately wanted to exchange the light-squared bishops with bishop h3. Once he exchanged light-squared bishops, black had no convenient way to defend the weak squares on c6 and e6. He later engineered the exchange of the dark-squared bishops, and after bishop takes, rook takes, queen takes, he recouped his pawn, but then his knights had infiltration points on the queen side. In the final position, knight a5, queen a8, and knight c4, the black knights are just dominating the position. White's doubled on the c-file. Black has many weaknesses. A classic textbook positional example by the maestro of the c3 Sicilian, Sveshnikov.